Welcome to Unit 11 on informative writing. We know that informative writing sometimes can also be called expository writing, and these sorts of essays are really to educate another on a particular topic. It's not for giving an opinion or trying to convince somebody through an argumentative stance or even change their beliefs. The most common formula for writing an informative essay includes a four-step sequence, starting with planning an introduction that has a hook, using one major supporting detail per paragraph, adding in supporting details for each of those, and then restating your thesis in your conclusion. But we know that writing is not always formulaic, and there's many more options for you when it comes to informative writing. The agenda for today is to really examine the current context around informative writing for all learners, for diverse learners, and then we're going to also look at some of the readings that were both controversial and salient to our topic this week. So if we were to first examine limited English proficient growth within the United States, the table depicts that it's not just huge metropolitan areas that experience increasing limited English proficient learners, but many states around the Republic. Further, it also shows, such as in Illinois or Tennessee and North Carolina, that there's an uneven rate of limited English proficient learners, and that teachers must be prepared to develop these proficiencies no matter where they live within the changing demographics that we have today, as well as the economic turmoil. The article from Gavigan and Albright really looked at how graphic novels are an increasingly popular format that educators can use as a tool to teach reading and writing skills across K-12 environments. This article describes a project in which incarcerated youth collaborated with a graphic illustrator to create a graphic novel about teens dealing with issues related to HIV and AIDS. This graphic novel is currently being used within these sorts of education circles as a preventative tool for teens so that they know the facts on this salient issue. The article examines the impact that creating that graphic novel had on the literacy lives of young authors, as well as the ways in which it's currently being used with teens across 2 states. And the authors presented a qualitative data piece on their observations and interviews of these students, which provided information on how educators can teach students to create their own comics and graphic novels. And I thought it was a provocative piece to really look at the process itself in terms of creating those digital texts, as we know that in the digital environment that we live today, that creation of information is a digital literacy skill. Further, the article serves as a resource for all disciplinary teachers, and the students who partook in that project recognized their content-specific knowledge development. In science, for example, they said, we learned how the disease can be transmitted, or in social studies, they researched the geography of the disease and where it came from. And then in writing class, it helped them in a bevy of ways, such as it helped us brush up on our writing skills. You develop a storyline and plot. We're authors too, and it's a fun way to develop writing skills while also learning about the topic. And that's pretty much all we can ask of adolescents, is to be excited about what they're learning while they are learning. The academic and linguistic needs of students really revolve around teachers' abilities to use promising practices. And these promising practices fall into 5 major categories. The first is orientation to the new land. So if you're an immigrant ever, I know I was when I moved to Australia, the first thing I had to do was orient myself to the new land and what were the expectations for me there. The second is educational efforts oriented towards the parents of those students, right? So how can we look at it from a communal and a holistic standpoint? The third is educational efforts oriented towards children and youth. So it's very important that we start this important work early in their stages of development. The fourth is after-school activities, and the fifth is improving the host society's perceptions of these people, and to have high expectations but also provide the means with which to achieve those. All of these have significant impacts on a student's informative writing abilities. For example, how can you write about an essay on a given topic if you don't fully understand the language, the context in which it is, and the society around you doesn't support you towards that end. So if students are to succeed in school, they must first acquire English quickly to participate in those everyday social interactions through peer learning and teacher-led conversations. They must also acquire enough English to allow them to learn within the subject disciplines, right? How do you learn science in English using the English language if you're not that fluent yet? And third is acquire interpersonal communicative proficiency. So how do you communicate with others in English if you've not yet mastered the language? These are things that have to be addressed specifically within school contexts. Their social needs are other things that need to be a point of focus. You know, we say it's an ironic cruelty experienced by a mass majority of these students where students' ability to comprehend the content academic is dependent upon their abilities to socially communicate and interact with others in that culture. For example, when I was in Australia, I allowed an international student to live with me, and he was from Hong Kong. So even though he had been in Australia for a few years, he was still figuring out the culture of a westernized civilization. Many of his friends were from either Hong Kong or mainland China, and so they spoke some of their native languages, and his ability to really converse with English-speaking people was greatly limited by his fear and trepidation of speaking English in public spaces. Also, there was little class time to be able to practice outside of a random presentation that might occur every quarter for these individuals to become more proficient in a limited risk environment. So what can we do to really build on their cultural capital in order to improve their informative writing abilities? And the first is, building on and recognizing their literate heritage and knowing that many of these students are fluent in their native tongue, and we have to reach out to see how we can make connections to that knowledge, to their prior experiences and their ways of seeing the world. And the second is to learn about different literate traditions and ways of thinking. So much like we talked about in previous weeks, where active participation might be viewed very differently in Western versus Eastern cultures, there are other literary traditions and practices that also differ between communities, and getting to the root of those to have an understanding allows us to understand our students to that much greater degree. Then we also need to think about access to their linguistic and cultural strengths, right? How do we gain access to that unless we communicate with them directly in a way that's fully understood? And so we need to think about strategic translation and using cognates when in every instance in which we can. So whether it's rosa or rose, those things mean the same thing based upon that common cognate, particularly when it comes to the Romance languages. And there are other opportunities to use native languages when we ask questions or clarify confusion, and encourage these students to ask questions and not critique each and every word that they use that might not be translated perfectly. We know that people think oftentimes using their native language, and then they have to mentally translate that information, and that takes time. That's a process that takes time, and then further time to master. Further, there's not always a direct translation. So, in carnivorous or carnivoro, there is a direct translation, but in many other cases there are not. And so how do people speak and communicate freely if there's not a direct translation? We know that is the case when it comes to Greek and Latin, where some languages are more precise, whereas English is much more muddied, for example. And we also have to think about access to curriculum of power, right? And then native English speakers. And when we think about that, our job is not necessarily to water down the curriculum, but to think about how can we translate that information through other means. How do we break down the readability? How do we make contact with native English speakers in the classroom while also providing opportunities to use other native languages without barriers? So for example, if one is a Spanish speaker in terms of their native tongue, why can't they substitute a Spanish word if they don't know the direct translation? And then together we can try to figure out the meaning of that and a better translation, especially with apps today like Google Translate, that you can do many of things on the fly, whether verbally, through picture, or through text. And then finally, we need to think about how that is really the central mission of schools today that are increasingly diverse. We need to make that as our primary focus and not necessarily just a piecemeal or peripheral account of these difficulties that native and non-native English speakers experience. So where to go from here? We need to think about how these strategies to promote reading and writing proficiency, particularly in informative writing, increase students' abilities to articulate their knowledge through writing. So we need to find new ways to teach academic language as part of our daily routines. And we need to find and encourage social interaction in ways that require sustained efforts when it comes to intensive linguistic interactions. And we need models of how to use valued and recognized literature in the L's for these English language learners. And all these things are necessary in terms of having gaps in the extant literature, requiring further research to this end. And I think the last thing that we need to consider is we need to better understand the attitudes of these learners towards various content and also their school experiences. I know that if I were put into an environment where we just speak French or we just speak Spanish, I'm going to get frustrated quite easily. I don't know what's going on. I'm pulling, piecemeal, factions of the conversation, and I understand very little. And so there needs to be a certain level of patience and modeling and scaffolding that's there in that community to know that the student is cared for, the student is supplied readily with what they need to make progress. And a caring and compassionate teacher is